Welcome to the Arizona Department of Education's video comparing the new Arizona Science Standards and the Next Generation Science Standards. This is part 2 of this two-part video series. In this short video, we will dig a little bit deeper into the similarities and differences between these two sets of standards by doing a side-by-side comparison of an NGSS standard and an Arizona Science Standard. The goal of this video is to help educators understand how to compare the standards using a step-by-step approach. We will now take a close look at one standard from the NGSS and one standard from the AzSS. The reason we are doing this is because when looking for resources to support our new standards, many educators wonder if they can use NGSS resources they find. In order to determine if any NGSS resource can be used to support our new Arizona Science Standards, educators need to do a deep comparison between the three dimensions that are embedded within the standard. For the first comparison, I chose two standards that I thought were closely related. To compare the standard, first start by looking at the coding of the standard. Notice that the coding is different. The NGSS example has MS, which means middle school and implies that this standard is meant for students in 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. In the Arizona Science Standard, this standard is specific to 8th grade. The next step is to compare the science and engineering practice embedded within the standard. In the NGSS example, it says develop models, and in the Arizona standard, it says develop and use a model. Then we look at the core ideas and compare them. In the NGSS example, the core idea is PS1, and the core idea for Arizona is P1U1. Because the coding is different, I would need to read the rest of the standard to see if the content matches before moving forward. Finally, compare the cross-cutting concepts embedded within each standard. In the NGSS example, the cross-cutting concept is scale, proportion, and quantity. What is different and unique to Arizona is that Arizona educators can choose which cross-cutting concept they believe best fits the standard. If you look at the standards document, you will see that a few of the cross-cutting concepts are bolded. These are bolded because these are suggested or recommended cross-cutting concepts that the standards committee believes best fit within the standard. But it is truly up to the educator in Arizona to decide which cross-cutting concept to ultimately use when designing instruction. So, to review, let's take a look at a side-by-side comparison of these two standards we just discussed. If you look at the coding, you can see that this is the first difference. The coding is not the exact same, but it is very similar. In the NGSS example, the grade level is not specific, but rather includes all of middle school, which is 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. In this example, the NGSS standard is for middle school, while the Arizona Science Standards place this standard in 8th grade only. This means an educator could possibly use this NGSS standard with 8th grade students, but we need to compare the standards a little more deeply in order to make that decision. Next, review the language of the actual standard. In this example, the content embedded within the two standards is fairly similar in terms of science content. So far, this standard is a good match. Then, start comparing the three dimensions of each standard. Begin with the science and engineering practices. As you can see, both standards say develop and use models, so that is a good match. Next, we look at the core ideas and notice that they are also very similar. The final dimension to compare is the cross-cutting concepts. Here we notice that this is not a match, but because Arizona educators have the unique opportunity to choose which cross-cutting concepts to use, this is a partial match. An educator in Arizona could choose to use scale, proportion, and quantity if they wanted to, and that is unique to Arizona. Remember that the committee bolded some suggested cross-cutting concepts for educators to use, but it is ultimately up to the educator to decide which cross-cutting concept to use. Although in this example the standards match fairly well, this occurrence does not happen with all standards. In the next slide, we are going to compare two standards that do not fairly match, so educators can feel confident in their ability to screen resources in the future. Let's compare these two standards and walk through the process one more time. I chose these two standards to compare because they have similar content. Both include the concept of interdependence of organisms in the domain of life science. To compare the standard, first start by looking at the coding. Notice that the coding is different. The NGSS example is for 5th grade and the Arizona example is for 3rd. This means these standards are from different grade bands and may not be a good match, even though they may have some science content that is similar. This is one of the tricky aspects about searching for resources to support our standards. The grade levels in which the standards lie are different between the two sets of standards. Next, review the language of the actual standard. In this example, the science content or core idea embedded in the standards is fairly similar, but the science and engineering practices are different. In the NGSS example, the science and engineering practice is develop models, whereas in the Arizona example, it is to construct an argument, which means these standards do not match. Then look at the core ideas and compare them. In the NGSS example, the core idea is LS2 and the core idea for Arizona is L2U1. Because the coding is different, I would need to read the rest of the standard to see if it matches. When I finish reading the content, it looks as though some of the content does match. Finally, compare the cross-cutting concepts. In the NGSS example, the cross-cutting concept is system and system models. And in the Arizona standard, and remember the bolded cross-cutting concepts are suggested by the committee members, are systems and system models and structure and function, which means this standard is a partial match when it comes to the cross-cutting concept. And remember, if an educator is unsure if the standard matches, it may be wise to reference the framework to read more closely about the standard. Here we will briefly summarize the comparison we just completed. To compare the standard, first start by looking at the coding. Notice that the coding is different. In the NGSS example, it says it's for 5th grade, and for Arizona, this standard lies in 3rd grade. This means these standards are from different grade bands and may not be a good match. Next, review the language of the actual standard. In this example, the science content embedded within the two standards is fairly similar, but the science and engineering practice is different. The next step is to compare the science and engineering practice. In the NGSS example, it calls for develop and use models, and in the Arizona standard, it says to construct an argument, which means these standards do not match. Then, look at the core ideas and compare them. In the NGSS example, the core idea is LS2 and the core idea for Arizona is L2U1. Because the coding is different, I would need to read the rest of the standard to see if the content matched. When reading the content, it looks as though some of the science content matches. Finally, compare the cross-cutting concept. In the NGSS example, the cross-cutting concept is system and system models, and in the Arizona standard, the bolded cross-cutting concepts are system and system models and structure and function. This is a partial match. And remember, if an educator is unsure if the standard matches, you can reference the framework to read more closely about the standard. So in conclusion, if we look at this side-by-side comparison, this is not a match, and I should not use the resources I found to support the Arizona Science Standard. To summarize what we have just discussed in this video, please remember that when you are searching for resources that support our new Arizona Science Standards, that you need to start by comparing the 3 dimensions within the standards to see if they match. Start by looking at the coding, then read each standard, compare the 3 dimensions including the science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and core ideas, and when in doubt, please reference the research documents to learn more about the individual standards. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and contact Rebecca Gorelli, the K-12 Science and STEM Specialist for the Arizona Department of Education. Thanks so much.